Welcome back! In the last episode, after spending a significant time starfaring in pursuit of exotic resources, I crafted a realm stone and twilight clock. Now, in true Meatballcraft fashion, it's time to disregard them for several hours and start randomly automating things. Well, sort of. The Twilight Clock and Realmstone are both items used to traverse dimensions, added by Divine RPG and Advent of Ascension respectively, but unlike the Sainagh artifact from last episode, they aren't used to program a warp drive and are instead used to light portals, some of which I'm building now. These portals are specifically the Advent of Ascension portals, which have the interesting trait of all being identical, as it's not actually their constituent blocks that determine the dimension they send you to, but instead the type of Realmstone you use on their central rune. The Realmstone I've crafted currently leads to no dimension and will need to be further enhanced before progression is made in that area. So right now I'm going to focus on Divine RPG's portal, which follows a more typical approach to dimensions, with the Twilight Clock just fulfilling a role as a glorified set of flint and steel. Before making the portal though, I do have to craft its blocks, which, all things considered, are pretty cheap, especially with Sainagh automated. Before jumping into my newly built portal though, I think it'd be best to set some clear short-term objectives. Thankfully, Bibliocraft has a neat clipboard that can be used as a checklist. Not only is this helpful for me, with it preventing me from spending several hours going down a useless rabbit hole, but it could also help provide some context to you all. In all honesty, I didn't really know what to expect from Eden. The last Divine RPG dimension I had visited, Issachar, was pretty lackluster in terms of clear objectives, so I sort of defaulted to the exploration protocol I used when dimension hopping last episode, and began searching for structures. The search wasn't exactly enlightening or anything, but it did net me a Master Spell Perditio, which is currently irrelevant but has its uses later on. Funnily enough, the most important loot from Eden didn't even come from any of its structures. It was simply a cow. Well, technically it's called an Eden Cadillion, but for our purposes it may as well be a cow. You see, Bloodmaster ingots are something that we're going to need a decent quantity of moving forward, and I'm going to be honest, a lot of the ways of automating them seem a little resource intensive. Fortunately, Eden's resident bovine drops Bloodmaster armor, which as demonstrated in Chapter 2 can be smelted down into Bloodmaster ingots, so after a quick mob duplicator installation, Bloodmaster was automated. You know how sometimes there's a massive quest that appears early on and you know you should do it before it becomes a problem, but you don't really want to because it isn't immediately required for progression? Well, if you've watched some of the previous episodes in this series, that probably seems like a very familiar situation, and it also just happens to be the one we're in now. The Mythic Assembler is an incredibly expensive, excessively large, and somewhat strangely shaped multi-block that retains very little relevancy after it's built, but it makes up for that by ensuring that several hours are spent gathering the resources to build it. On the upside though, it does provide a good excuse to re-automate Mythmanite. I don't know if you guys remember episode 2's Mythmanite automation, and honestly it's probably for the best that you don't. I mean, outside of the fact that half of the infrastructure I set up for it was redundant, it looked like this. Regardless, taking it down was nowhere near as satisfying as I thought it would be, and after crafting a Mithrilium chicken egg to avoid repeating the same mistake I made last time, I proceeded to begin reassembling the automation, which was sort of a tight squeeze in this automation hall, but I couldn't really think of anywhere else to put it. A major issue I was running into with this process is actually getting the required V crystals into the setup. I thought I could like sub-network them or something to minimize network usage, but I ended up just stringing 3 export buses into drawer controllers. After working out a few kinks in the apparatus that caused some V crystal supply chain disruptions, Mythmanite had been successfully re-automated, which unfortunately means I'll have to move on to crafting spatial pylons for the Mythic Assembler. I mean, the devs were really pulling out all the stops when it came to making this thing a pain to obtain. Spatial pylons are really just a smorgasbord of random items, most notably strange dust that can only be retrieved through processing random ores from the nether, Endurio's dimensional transceiver, which has enough microcrafting to feed a GregTech player for a week, dreaded steel, which is always a pleasure to craft, and a Dreadlands infused power stone. Due to the dimensional transceiver's intense resource costs, and those resources' intense processing times, I had time to craft pretty much everything needed for the pylons except the Dreadlands infused power stone. This is because I thought it would be a good idea to passively automate it. Now, I'm not saying it was a bad idea, but I'm not saying it was the best use of my time either. First things first, I needed a sterilized sacrificial altar. Why? So I could craft more sterilized sacrificial altars. It's not like I don't already have one, it's just that I'm tired of having to empty out its input hatches of whatever I've assigned it to process whenever I want to craft anything. However, sterilized sacrificial altars kind of take up space, which I don't have. I mean, I realize my base is sitting with an infinite expansive void with which I could expand into for eternity. It's just that the altars don't have anywhere to sit. Taking this as an opportunity for some significant base expansion, I decided to finally make a manual processing hall. Yeah, I haven't had one of those since before I moved into the infinite expansive void. Coinciding with my decision to build a manual processing hall, I also moved all the items from my dinky storage scanner setup into my AE2 system. Well, kind of. You see, I don't want all my passive processes taking away items I could potentially craft with, so instead I set up my storage drives on a separate network, which I then interfaced to the main network, which sort of made my main network a sub-network, but that's not really important. A fun takeaway from the whole moving several hundred hours worth of items into my storage system is that I have a disturbing amount of drawers filled with items sitting around. This wouldn't normally be a problem, but several of these drawers are filled with tens of thousands of items, and I don't really want to flood my new drive so quickly. Meanwhile, on the processing hall front, I begin setting up some basic machines. You know, your macerator, alloy furnace, the essentials. Hopefully this will soften the blow of another item the ME Mythic Assembler requires en masse, fusion coils. Again, the devs were really intent on making this machine expensive. I actually spent a great deal of time working on the processing hall, which sort of makes sense seeing as it's one of those things that are kind of essential for playing a mod pack like this one. If you're wondering what I was doing during Chapter 3, my idea of a processing hall consisted of an ever-growing array of machines next to my storage scanner. Once I got the processing hall into an operable state, I installed 2 sterilized sacrificial altars in its basement, which I began to automate before I realized that they needed liquid LP and not life essence in order to operate, so I ended up installing an LP harvester down there as well. And just when I was this close to passiving the Power Stone, my computer ran into a slight hiccup. Sparing the rather boring details, I ended up not making any progress for a month. This isn't actually too relevant to the video because I picked up exactly where I left off once my computer was repaired, though I will say I'm playing on a restored backup version of the world due to it corrupting sometime during the whole ordeal, so that's why my journey map got reset. Ignoring all that, the Power Stone was relatively easy to automate, and soon enough it was the only item I was waiting on for the spatial pylons. This is really due to an unfortunate bottleneck involving the LP harvester's ability to, well, harvest LP, but honestly the wait wasn't horrible, and soon enough I had my pylons. Which means I'm back to getting the resources for those fusion coils. I've decided to set up some small stopgap automation measures for some of the resources required, especially the neutron reflectors, because those things are a pain to craft 100% manually. When waiting for the reflector materials to percolate, I came upon the unfortunate realization that the Mythic Assembler also needs Dark Soul machine chassis, and then another unfortunate realization that it also needs Molten Salt machine casings. The thing is, Dark Soul machine chassis have been passived, whereas Molten Salt machine casings have not. And true to my nature, I decide that therefore they must be. Molten Salt casings are mostly made up of resources I've already automated, so the process of passiving them really only consisted of telling an interface to export into a crafting table. Well, with the exception of the Tellurium crystal, which I was not going to automate, because it required the Thaumatorium. And if you know anything about Thaumcraft multi-block automation, it's not very fun. That said, I will automate the dense carbon clusters required to make Tellurium crystals by setting up an array of Abyssal-Craft crystallizers. Like machines from most Magic mods, they're a little finicky with what size they like to output to, but they work, so I guess it's fine. Once they produced enough of the dense carbon, I unloaded it into a crucible filled with Dreadium, delivered the Tellurium crystals to my ME system, and crafted up some Molten Salt casings, completing the laundry list of blocks needed for the ME Mythic Assembler. In a classic twist of fate, now that it's built, I will now neglect this multi-block for the majority of this chapter. Fortunately, that means I can focus on working towards significantly more interesting goals, like crafting those special realm stones I was talking about earlier. Now, because some future Mythic miners unlocked by the Realm Stones require some pretty exotic resources, my first priority before actually doing any dimension hopping is to speed up the sterilized sacrificial altar, as there's a few important items I'll have to craft in there. Speeding the altar up required a short trip to the Between Lands, as a mob there can get me a data model that produces rock snot pearls, which constitute the block that activates the upgrade. Once I trained the data model, I actually ended up setting up the simulation chamber and loop fabricator for it inside of my processing hall, because I think it's about time I have a general DML processing setup that isn't dedicated to any particular model. After crafting the block of pearls out of rocksnot, I set up a new sterilized sacrificial altar on top of my processing hall, as I want to passively automate tar beast hearts. I don't really have to, but they are needed in some realmstone adjacent blocks that will be important later, so it'll be nice not to have to craft them. The automation setup was going quite swimmingly until I realized that because tar drips, one of the ingredients for tar beast hearts, requires sludge bricks, I need a passive supply of Betweenlands mud, which, oddly enough, doesn't have EMC. In fact, the only reliable passive source of the stuff was from an environmental tech resource miner, so I ended up situating one in the void and sending the mud back up to the automation area. Despite the resource miner's abhorrent speed, my newly automated setup managed to spit out one tar beast heart. Now that they're automated though, I'm going to let them build up while I passive tech reborn. Okay, when I say it like that, it sounds like I'm going to automate the mod itself or something. I'm just trying to passive a lot of its finicky components because there's sort of a bottleneck when crafting, and they're needed in somewhat unrealistic quantities for producing UU matter. After finding a suitable location for the production room, I get to work installing the walls and ceiling. I also end up adding some ore buffers to my void ore miner, as it's been doing practically nothing almost the entire time it's been placed, and I wanted to just mine some ores. Before automating the tidbits needed for UU matter, I prioritize passiving highly advanced machine frames, as they're going to become incredibly important to have at the ready later on. I'll be honest, there isn't a lot worth mentioning about the process of automating them, because it really just consisted of stringing a bunch of tech reborn machines to each other and hooking them up to a refined EMC link. Just as a side note here, sometimes I feel bad about skipping over so many details when writing scripts for this series, but I would be honest, with how much automation takes place over the course of the series, I think it'd get really boring if I spent half the runtime of every video describing how I used Ender.io conduits to hook up some new machines. Like, I'd say roughly 80% of all automation in this mod pack is Ender.io conduits and filtering with Ender.io conduits, so actually huge shout out to Ender.io for basically preventing my entire base from being a catastrophic disaster zone of dire wire. Anyways, I then proceed to automate energy flow circuits, which are used in a matter reprocessor in order to produce UU matter. In a typical pack, UU matter is produced by recycling junk items, but this is Meatballcraft, so instead I'm going to have to feed a custom multi-block circuits and a small nation's power supply. These circuits aren't cheap either, as they're essentially the highest tier circuit Tech Reborn has to offer. That said, much like the highly advanced machine frames, most of the resources used in the circuits are just processed versions of base metals like copper and iron, making it pretty easy to just route everything in through EMC and have a machine while take care of the rest. The cool thing about having highly advanced machine frames automated was that the matter reprocessor was really easy to assemble. The not as cool thing about having highly advanced machine frames automated is that the speed at which the multi-block was assembled hastened the epitome about to take place. You see, I've mentioned the matter reprocessor consuming energy flow circuits twice now. I mean, that's the reason I automated their production. Well, they aren't consumed. Yeah, it was literally written on the tooltip of their recipe. Once I was done processing that revelation, I moved the reprocessor away from the circuit production area, as UU matter isn't used in any recipes relevant to Tech Reborn, and it would be more convenient for it to be closer to my Mythic miners. This is because UU matter is used inside of a spatial crucible, along with some items coming from the Mythic miners, to make weak recursive essence, which is used to fuel some higher tier Mythic miners that'll be unlocked once I explore some AOA dimensions. The spatial crucible, which is the multi-block I'm installing below the matter reprocessor, notably contains spatial pylons, which, considering their expense, have become sort of a sore subject for me. But, in a fit of rare foresight, I decided to craft more pylons than I needed to back when I was crafting them for the ME Mythic Assembler, because I knew I'd have to build one of these multi-blocks eventually. Actually, now that I'm at it, I may as well prepare as much as possible for the incoming Mythic miners. You see, each advent of Ascension dimension has a corresponding Mythic miner that needs both weak recursive essence and a unique fluid to operate. Additionally, these miners require special blocks called caps to form, and they tend to require some pretty strange items to craft. In order to streamline the dimension-faring process as much as possible, I'm going to passive all the fluids and gather as many of the items for the caps as possible, although I can't gather all the items as some of them are statues that drop from a boss in the caps corresponding dimension. The first Mythic miner fluid I automated was Eutetic Sodium Potassium Living Gold. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of infrastructure around my Mythic miner area to actually make any of the fluids with, so I opted to automate it in my Tech Reborn area. Well, some of it. I'm going to try and lay down a foundation for some infrastructure in the Mythic miner area, but the production of sodium potassium alloy, the precursor to sodium potassium living gold, is a little more involved, so I'd rather put it somewhere more geared for the task. That said, I sent the Eutetic sodium potassium alloy along with the living gold over to the Mythic miner area to be mixed into the Eutetic sodium potassium living gold. The next two fluids, Aerial Moonshine and Spicy Pyrotheum, were significantly less involved fluids to produce, with Aerial Moonshine's production boiling down to pipe an apple through a few machines, then mix it with some processed resources from a DML setup, and Spicy Pyrotheum being a combination of Pyrotheum, which is a fluid I have automated, and peppers, which are being produced by my Mythic miners. Luminous Lava was slightly more difficult to automate, as it required crystallized obsidian from Cyclic, which in turn needed amber to craft. I neglected to use Mystical Agriculture for amber passiving, and instead went with taking the amber ore out of my recently installed Void Miner buffer and processing it. After the amber was taken care of, there was a small amount of additional processing, leaving me with only 2 more fluids left to automate. Weakened Cryotheum was a little annoying because in one of its intermediate steps I had to combine Eutetic sodium potassium mixture with Cryotheum. This slowed down my production of the sodium potassium living gold and strained the salt supply I was using to make my sodium, but it never actually became a problem. The last fluid I needed was Molten Dragon's Blood Plastic. Due to my investment in several trees over by my magic area, this was made a walk in the park as I was already producing Dragon's Blood Plastic from the resin they were dropping, so all I had to do was melt it down, and soon enough I had all 6 fluids for the Mythic miners buffering in black hole tanks. In retrospect, I really did not need to passive all these fluids so early, as slightly later on, significantly more efficient ways of producing them are unlocked, and I'm pretty sure 1 hour of the fluids being produced by my current system would last until long after the better methods become available for me to produce, but I digress. Now for the cap ingredients. Each Void Miner has its own cap, which in turn has its own ingredients, but there is a lot of crossover in the ingredients they need, including the Tar Beast hearts, which I've already automated. There's also a bunch of ingredients that don't have crossover, including Creeper Heads and Tier 4 Woot shards for the Gribonia cap, which I knocked out with 1 stone by using Woot to automate the heads, Gneiss for the Percacia cap, which I produced in a Cold Iron Forge, Ritual Anchors for the Barathos cap, which needs some Astral Sorcery shenanigans to craft, and a whole bunch of other random junk. I mean, one moment I'm wandering around the Twilight Forest, the next I'm compressing cobblestone. With all the resources, bar the boss statues from inside the dimensions gathered to make the caps, I can finally focus on making the Realm Stones. At the moment, 6 dimensions Realm Stones are obtainable. These dimensions, known as the first Mythic Shell, are kind of the gateway into the true mid-game of the pack, as exploring the Mythic Shells and building Mythic Miners using resources from them is kind of like the core gameplay loop of Meatballcraft. That said, I only have 1 blank Realm Stone, which means I need to craft 5 more. I'll say, actually having my items in an AE2 system made this process a lot easier than the first time I did it at the end of Chapter 3. Now that I have 6 blank Realm Stones, I need to be concerned about the recipes that turn blank Realm Stones into the variants needed to open the portals, which thankfully aren't very expensive. Like, looking at all the ingredients laid out in the crate I prepared before crafting them, the biggest roadblock was all the essentia I needed, because naturally these things will be crafted in an infusion altar, but outside of the essentia, the only thing that really posed any difficulty were some of those artifacts you can see in the 6th column of the crate, but that's just because I had to craft them in an arcane auto-infuser I was using to produce Mythmanite. You know, that's another machine I should really put in my processing hall. You might remember how at the start of the episode I was building the portals that I'm about to activate using the Realm Stones I just crafted. Well, it turns out I only actually built 2, so unfortunately you're going to have to sit through me building the other 4 before we actually get to go into dimensions. Alright, there we go. Now I can start activating portals. When considering what dimension I wanted to venture into first, there wasn't a lot of competition. Actually, the whole reason I played modern Minecraft at all stems from this dimension. Basically, back in I want to say it was, hold on. Okay, so I was going to just look up the date and put it in the script, but I think we gotta talk about the fact that Popular MMO's Epic Proportions Season 9 is a decade old. I mean, I was just gonna say, I used to watch Popular MMOs, and he had a series where himself and Jen went to different AoA dimensions, and the one with Creeponia was the first one I watched, and that got me into modern Minecraft. But an entire decade? That's just crazy to me. Anyways, mental breakdown aside, the first dimension I went to was Creeponia, and there's basically only 3 things I needed to do there. First off, I needed to gather some flying gunpowder, as it'll come in handy later. Second, I needed to gather some stone so I could use it to build the Creeponia resource miner. And third, I needed to kill the CREEP. In all honesty, I don't know if it's supposed to be like a hitchhiker or a geriatric or what. All I know is that keeping it trapped in an obsidian box was a good way to expend as little effort as possible when killing it. Like all Advent of Ascension bosses, it dropped a trophy of itself upon death, which seems a little narcissistic, but I'm not complaining, as I need the trophy to build some caps. I will wait until I have traveled through all the dimensions before building the Mythic miners though, as I want to build them all at once. The next dimension I decided to grace with my presence was the Abyss. Let me tell you, the Abyss is not where you want to be. Like, a dimension full of creepers is bad and all, but the Abyss is just abysmal, absolutely rock bottom. You can imagine how happy I was upon realizing that not only does it have 2 bosses, but there's also some custom challenges I need to complete there as well. The first boss, aptly named the Shadow Lord, was one of those flying bosses where the best way to counter them is just hide in a strange hole and kill them while they hover over you. As for the first challenge, it was just avoiding a watcher and digging into a floating island to get an abyssal wormhole, which honestly sounds way more interesting than it actually is. The second challenge was slightly more involved, having me go on a killing spree inside of a bedrock box in order to obtain abyssal flesh, which is another one of those items that won't become important until later on. I actually ended up fighting the second boss twice though, because true to its name, it completely disappeared the first time I fought it. Ignoring that though, the fight was pretty easy and I could move on from the Abyss. With Creeponia and the Abyss down, it's time to take on the Deeplands. Unlike the Abyss, completing the Deeplands was easy, seeing as I just summoned the boss using some drops from the locals, then killed it without really having to dodge or run or really do anything other than swing my sword. Actually, raiding the Deeplands took so little time I honestly thought I forgot to record doing so because I simply skipped over the footage when skimming my clips. Lelietia, however, took a little bit more time. This dimension's a funny one because it has this really strange thing going on with gravity. And by strange, I also mean buggy. Yeah, not sure exactly what's going on here. Regardless, I took down the boss without a hitch, but then proceeded to lose my mind when attempting to loot this upside down dungeon thing for a wormhole. You know what's worse than a slightly buggy flipped gravity mechanic? A slightly buggy flipped gravity mechanic and shulkers. After desecrating the dungeon beyond repair and still failing to find the chest I was looking for, I decided the best course of action was to spend the next 30 minutes of my life looking for a new dungeon. Thankfully, the second time I raided it, I forwent all the hassle and just decided to use a storage scanner to find the chest I was looking for. Hey, what are we doing back in the Deeplands? Well, apparently I flew over this crab summoner thing that's supposed to get me a shard that'll become useful later. Yep, here it is. And I guess this is the crab that drops it? I love how strange this modpack is sometimes. With 4 dimensions down, it's time to enter Baratos. Apart from the occasional structure, I think this is one of the least interesting AoE dimensions, as it really just resembles a mesa biome, but it makes up for that by having the only boss in the first mythic shell that I struggled with. Well, I say struggled with as though I died to it or something. It was more like I was just taking more damage than I wanted to. That said, taking damage did heal the boss, so that was kind of a problem. The solution was pretty simple though. I just dug her into a pit with trapdoors on the wall so her projectiles couldn't escape. Look, at no point did I say I'm above cheesing anything, alright? Baratos, like the Abyss, also came with a second boss, but in all honesty, killing the mobs to craft the boss summon was more difficult and time consuming than fighting the boss itself. After claiming a Baratos wormhole from a horrible chamber filled with Arachios for some reason, I entered the last dimension of the first mythic shell, Percasia. I think that Percasia is actually supposed to be the first dimension visited in a normal AoE playthrough, but I'm not really too sure about that. Regardless, I wanted to do Percasia last because it has one of my favorite boss fights in Advent of Ascension. Not sure how much that's saying coming from me considering my usual approach to bosses, but you gotta trust me on this one. Firstly though, I'm going to dispatch the Tyrosaur, who happens to be on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of fun, especially when considering the fact that they will damage you whenever you're touching the ground regardless of your proximity to them. This resulted in my coming up with the genius solution of floating in water and wildly swinging at them until they die. The next boss though is the interesting one. Upon hitting an army block, a Skella Elder will be summoned, and as I'm sure you can guess from the block's rather on-the-nose name, killing the Skella Elder summons waves upon waves of skeletons that have to be killed. Eventually, once the waves tire out, this freaky Skeletron thing will come out, and killing them will end the boss fight. I just gotta say, I love horde boss fights. Personally, I don't think Minecraft is the type of game where having a single boss with an attack set makes sense, seeing as its combat is so primitive. I just think the challenge of managing many enemies at once works better with the combat system and is generally more fun. Nevertheless, with the Skeletron defeated, all there was left to do was raid an underground temple, steal a wormhole, and return to base, the first Mythic shell having been thoroughly conquered. And just like that, I can start making the caps, along with everything else needed for the Mythic miners. This is what's so great about preparation. Once the miners were assembled, though, I sort of ran into a problem with the fluid logistics. Well, not so much of a problem, more like a massive chore. Routing 6 unique fluids along one fluid conduit requires a lot of filtering. I do gotta say though, the only thing worse than fluid logistics is item logistics. With the installation of 6 new void miners, I practically doubled my item output, which means I've got to spend a lot of time connecting item lasers and crafting black hole units. Except that I ran out of the plastic for the black hole units. Fortunately, we are in a post-first Mythic Shell world where opportunities jump out from behind every corner. In this case, our helpful opportunity is the Gra data model. Gra, the boss from Low Yeti that didn't even deserve a mention because of how easy it was, just so happens to have plastic in their DML loot pool. So after killing them a few times to program the model, I had basically unlimited plastic, which is great because I need a lot more black hole units. Curious about those wormholes I've mentioned once or twice? Well, they're not actually going to be used at all in this video, but I am going to gather all of them. So, while some of them I can collect from dimensions, some of them needed to be retrieved via callstone. Neither the Creeponia or Deeplands callstone was particularly expensive because I made the good choice to craft them after installing the Mythic miners, which made the main resources they needed, tokens, a trivial matter to obtain. On the other hand, once used, neither of these callstones were exactly trivial, with the Creeponia one bent on blowing me up, and the Deeplands one forcing me to perform a pretty sketchy extraction operation, including a block placer and a scanner after killing all the smashes it summoned on me failed to unlock its loot. While on the subject of callstones, I used some of the UU matter I was producing over by my Mythic miners to craft the Call of the Haunted, which apart from assaulting me with ghosts and strange marks on my screen, netted me 4 record fragments, which are essential in crafting the Eden Core, my next goal. The Eden Core is one of those items that requires a plethora of items from different mods in order to be crafted, and as such it'll have me doing a bunch of completely disjointed tasks in quick succession. Firstly, I went over to Eden to kill a guy called Sunstorm for some Hearts of Eden. While not a difficult boss per se, it did take 5 minutes straight of swinging at it with my sword to kill, which was annoying when I had to kill it twice to have enough hearts to craft the Eden Core. And now it looks like we're over in my astral area. Yep, it's time to grow some gems. The Eden Core needs 4 Ilium gems? And if you know anything about me and astral sorcery crystal growing, we're about to spend a long time getting them. And I mean a long time. In fact, I went and discovered a new constellation in the time it took for these gems to grow. And these aren't even the right gems. I thought that in order for astral sorcery gems to grow, it had to be nighttime. Otherwise, they just end up sitting in liquid starlight forever. It turns out this is not the case. And in fact, for Ilium gems to be produced, it has to be daytime. So maybe I ended up wasting 40 minutes trying to figure out why the right gems weren't forming, but that's okay, because I figured it out eventually. And I'm going to quickly divert myself from the Eden Core here, because I decided that I needed to go back to Haumea and kill this elephant guy for its heart. Why? I needed to summon a meteor of demon stone using a blood magic ritual. You know, putting it that way makes it sound a lot more demented than it really is. This process is basically identical to the one I used to obtain Draconic Stone last episode, with the only difference being the Baku heart dropped from the elephant being used as their sacrifice for the ritual. What is the demon stone used for? Well, nothing at the moment, but as I say, it always pays to be prepared. It was really just for a quest. Focusing back on the Eden Core, I had almost everything I needed besides some photonium ingots, which I crafted up real quick, and a properly tuned crystal to provide the correct constellation of the craft. I've always found the iridescent altar's crafting mechanic to be a little confusing. Like, I don't know what other people think about it, but having both the constellation mechanic and the placing random items on pedestals throughout the craft mechanic seems to be one too many cogs and whistles going on at once, and makes it practically impossible to automate. This is all sort of a moot point though, as the eating core does have EMC, which means I'm never even thinking of crafting this recipe again. With the eating core complete, it's automation time. One of the various items produced by my new Mythic miners are garnets, which have several uses, the most important of them being the ability to crack open specific resource eggs pertaining to the Mythic miner's corresponding dimension, because it turns out that Mythic miners only produce some of the resources needed from the dimensions they correspond to, not all of them. And chickens laying eggs is the best way to solve that. These chickens do come with a price though, requiring me to shut down my Sainagh production and use my plasmatic condenser to craft their eggs instead. Additionally, their eggs need to be housed inside of a coop that requires a lot of petrified wood. As I haven't had any luck finding petrified wood naturally in Erebus, I decided to craft it all with a cold iron forge instead. This might have been a mistake, seeing as the cold iron forge was miserably slow, but it's not like I can't just go AFK for a bit, so it's fine. What's interesting about egg cracking is that it's given a surprising amount of nuance by the pack. Basically, there are 3 tiers of efficiency that can be reached within Chapter 4, but right now we're stuck on the basic one, being combining 1 egg with 1 garnet to get the resources inside. Also, because I know this might be confusing, the eggs I craft in the plasmatic condenser are not the eggs I'm cracking. The eggs I crafted go in a coop that produces a slightly different egg, which is then cracked. The reason it's weird like this is because technically the crafted eggs are spawn eggs for chickens that would drop the resource eggs like a vanilla chicken would, but the devs provide a multi-block that makes everything a little more convenient. Nevertheless, because I was on the most basic tier of egg processing, I decided to make the setup for cracking the eggs very temporary, as upgrades should be coming pretty fast, and having a massive supply of the resources the eggs provide isn't actually that important right now. While I have my plasmatic condenser decommissioned from producing Sainagh, I may as well also make some fluctuatite, and then the chicken that produces it. Fluctuatite isn't exactly Sainagh in terms of importance, but it is a metal I'm going to use sporadically from time to time, so having a passive supply of it would definitely be a good idea. Using the new resources that my egg cracking setup is producing for me, I crafted jeweled runium and some vibranium. Honestly, these resources are not that important at the moment, besides in small quantities in some recipes they gate. However, they will become very important later, and in a complete lapse of judgment, I completely failed to passive them. That might actually be a first for this series, but no matter, I'll give them justice in due time. With the small amount of jeweled runium and vibranium I did craft, I can begin to assemble a warper to Vibe, which is one of the custom dimensions added by Meatballcraft. Regrettably, the warper also needed some more of those astral sorcery gems I struggled with making, but I sidestepped the problem by crafting them in a custom multi-block instead. Thank goodness for Meatballcraft's dedication to trivializing magic mods with multi-blocks, otherwise I would be fried. As we all know, fusion coils have long been a problem for me to produce, namely due to the incredibly expensive neutron deflectors they require. You're not gonna believe what else the Vibe Warper needs in order to be crafted. Yeah, at this point I dedicated myself to just laying the whole neutron deflector problem to rest by setting up a small semi-passive automation for them in my processing hall. It might be really slow, but it'll be nice not to have to do each individual microcraft manually. Interestingly, the Vibe Warper isn't like the others in that you can't travel to Vibe by placing it in a wormhole generator. Instead, once I crafted it, I had to build this strange structure in the overworld and right-click it while standing in the center. While exploring Vibe, I only had one goal: mine some vibrating stone, which, now that I think about it, is probably the reason the dimension's called Vibe. Anyway, I did that pretty much immediately because it was just sitting on the surface waiting to be mined. However, that wasn't all Vibe had to offer. I obtained a tainted heart by killing the tainted soul, found draconic and acidic bees, and retrieved a pure chicken egg. Out of all this loot, very little of it was of immediate importance other than the vibrating stone, which I used to promptly craft the next warper. The Phenom Warper, unlike its predecessor, was nowhere near as expensive to craft, thank goodness it didn't need fusion coils, making for a very smooth transition into exploring Phenom. Unlike many of the other Warper dimensions so far, Phenom doesn't resemble the overworld in the slightest, and is more reminiscent of either a barcode or a really gaudy pinstripe suit. That stripy material, though, is exactly why I'm here, because with it I can achieve the second tier of egg cracking efficiency. Scattered around the dimension, there were also a lot of angry ender chickens, which made exploring just a little bit difficult. The striped rock I collected from Phenom's surface, dolomite, isn't exactly useful in its current state, simply because it isn't easy to produce as is. While setting up an interdimensional quarry might sound fun, there is a much easier way to get lots of the stuff though, which is naturally through EMC. Dolomite itself doesn't have EMC though, and instead I need to turn it into endergenic sediment using a bunch of juice I collected from Finham's oceans. I think we know the drill by now. Did I actually use the endergenic sediment to make more dolomite that I could use to make my egg processing more efficient? No. Did I go down a strange rabbit hole side quest that resulted in me doing absolutely nothing important? Well, I mean, I did do at least one thing that was important, but yeah, I went down a rabbit hole. But my processing hall finally has an automatic infusion altar. No more going to the overworld and juicing 5 million items just to watch my altar explode in my face. Well, actually that's a lie, because some recipes can't be performed in an automatic infusion altar, but the current recipe I'm dealing with should be. That current recipe is the Mythic Scythe. Unfortunately, the next recipe does require an actual infusion altar, so disregard everything I said about it being used for whatever. That next recipe is the Vibrating Mythic Scythe, which takes the Mythic Scythe, which is essentially just a stack of Mythic ingots bent into a C shape, and combines it with some vibrating stone. Not sure exactly what that accomplishes in the context of the lore or anything, but in terms of progression, it allows me to turn any tainted soil in Vibe into Ichor, which is needed a lot in the side quest chain I'm following. Then I got completely distracted and started making runes for a multi-block called the Sentient Coagulator, which takes life essence and converts it into weak blood shards. This is actually part of the main quest line, and I have no idea why I decided on a whim to do this in the middle of the Tainted Vibe saga, but I guess I have my priorities? After assembling the Sentient Coagulator in the basement of my processing hall, I got back on track. Or, well, I guess back off track, and started extracting massive amounts of tainted soil from the cataclysmic zone over in the overworld. You see, the callstone I need to progress through this quest chain requires a singularity made of Ichor, which means I need a lot of tainted soil to convert. Thankfully, I guess I had a premonition or something and have had this massive taint patch in my world since episode 2, so obtaining the tainted soil is as easy as setting up an Arv Tools quarry with a filter. In order to make the Ichor, however, a slightly more complex setup was used, as I have to stand on top of the tainted soil and click with the vibrating Mythic Scythe in order for it to be converted. Using formation and annihilation planes from AE2, I managed to automate the block breaking and placing process, leaving me to just spam right click for a while. Once I had all the Ichor I needed, I compressed it into a singularity and combined it with some vibrating stone and Mythnite at my infusion altar. Yeah, another recipe that can't use the automated one. This crafted the Tainted Callstone, which is also as far as I made it down this quest line. Why is that? Because I got schooled by the boss that awaited me on the other side of that callstone. So much so that I don't think I can actually re-enter Vibe without getting killed. I'd like to note, I had gone several hundred hours without getting killed at this point, so this was kind of a shock, really. Dying like that kinda made me decide it was time for a major priority rethink. Remember the clipboard from way earlier that I said was going to be useful and then I never used? It's back, baby! And this time, I am actually going to use it. Totally. So after milling about for a bit, I decided the best course of action was to start working on making my egg cracking process more efficient, while also improving the efficiency of my Mythic Miner fluid production. Remember that more efficient method I mentioned back when I was saying how passiving all the fluids so early was unnecessary? Well, setting up the Mythic Miners and having them run for a bit unlocked this method, and it's a good time to implement it. There are some general infrastructure improvements I do have to make before automating everything though, starting with an expansion to my processing room, as the Thaumic Replicators, which are the specialized devices that make the more efficient method of fluid production possible, will need a place to go. At this time, I also realized that my V-Crystal production over at the apparatus is failing miserably due to a problem with my V-Crystal storage. Apparently, some of the drawers had filled up and the crystals they were supposed to store were blocking other Essentia pods from being processed into crystals. The solution I used here is actually really cool and is probably one of my favorite mass storage solutions. Basically, I store the crystals in black hole units, which were then stored in black hole controllers, which can contain up to 12 black hole units each. I then connected all of the controllers to an Actually Editions item laser network, connected the AA interface with an AE2 interface, and piped in the crystals into the AA interface. This essentially provided a very clean way of merging several outputs into one massive storage solution, while also keeping AE2 channel usage to a minimum. I love Actually Editions item lasers. Another major infrastructure improvement was the construction of several recursive loops, specifically the wrought iron, dolomite, and flying gunpowder loops. While both the wrought iron and gunpowder loops will not become important until the very end of this chapter, the dolomite loop, as mentioned previously, is critical to obtaining better egg cracking methods. Essentially, the dolomite loop consists of turning endergenic sediment into dolomite by combining it with an ender pearl, as one has the EMC, the endergenic sediment, and one does not, the normal dolomite. Now, does it have a really high EMC cost? Yeah, but I think you've realized by now I'm not really concerned with EMC consumption. Like, I don't know how, but my EMC is still just going up regardless of how much automation I set up, so I'm going to use it. Now, in preparation for the thermic replicators taking over the fluid production from my temporary fluid passiving setup, I decided to completely tear down almost all of my Mythic miner infrastructure and rebuild it from the ground up. This process is incredibly time consuming and involves me tearing down way more than just direct Mythic miner infra, as the entire area is basically sent back to square one. RIP my dreaded steel automation, you will not be missed. Especially because dreaded steel actually comes from one of my first Mythic shell miners. You know what takes longer than tearing down a massive amount of infrastructure? Building it back up. This is especially the case when you want to make your new systems more efficient, which is definitely what I'm trying to do here. I don't know if you remember my Nethenjaic rune automation from last episode, but upon its reconstruction here, I opted to use DML to duplicate starfield gems so I wouldn't have to craft the transformation powder it uses in its recipe in one of those carbonite multi-blocks. Even more time consuming than new DML setups is the construction and automation of the thermic replicators. Once placed down, I needed to rebuild two major points of infrastructure before getting them online. First off, I rebuilt the storage system for the resources mined from my Mythic miners using the same method I used for my V crystals in the apparatus, which saved me a lot of channels for future expansions in the area. Then I started re-automating some of the precursor fluids needed in making the Mythic miner fluids. This is because thermic replicators essentially just take the same recipes being used to make the original fluids and make them higher yield, while requiring some extra things like essentia, weak recursive essence, and the garnets produced by Mythic miners. The essentia requirement was an especially time-consuming one, as in order to prevent a bunch of essentia smelters clogging up my base with flux, I would have to make a bunch of high-tier mithrilium smelters that don't produce any flux pollution, which aren't exactly the cheapest things ever, whether or not you're considering their material or V cost. Even once they were crafted, the smelters still presented a hurdle, as trying to automate them in an incredibly cramped thermic replicator automation corridor was far from ideal. Is it sort of my fault for making the incredibly cramped thermic replicator automation corridor? Yes, but don't let that distract you from the fact that each individual replicator needs its own type of essentia to run, therefore needing its own smelter. Once the essentia half the replicator automation was complete, I moved on to re-automating weak recursive essence, which was significantly less of a hassle. And with essentia, recursive essence, the precursor fluids, and a flow of garnets from my AE2 system all being piped into my thermic replicators, I connected them to my Mythic miners and fired them up. Due to my diligence in fluid filtering, almost all the correct fluids were delivered to my Mythic miners via Ender.io conduit. Like, maybe there were some filtering complications, but that was really inevitable, okay? By using thermic replicators instead of the less efficient single-block methods of producing Mythic miner fluids, I've introduced a problem I have to be wary of while automating things going forward. My Mythic miners now depend on a resource they produce for fuel. If I were to somehow run out of garnets, I would be practically dead in the water until I can jerry-rig some of the original fluid setups back together. This isn't a massive concern, as the garnet to fluid ratio is pretty generous, and I'm priority exporting garnets to the replicators, but it does make me want to be more thrifty with the garnets I'm not using in them. That said, it's finally time to use that dolomite I'm producing to cut some garnets. After I build a place for that to take place, of course. Side note, my base is starting to get kinda big. Anyways, using crushed dolomite, I can cut down one garnet into 4, which naturally gets me 4 times as many resources as a normal garnet. This efficiency boost, while not the best one available, is good enough to justify my setting up a semi-permanent egg cracking setup, which I do right above the gem cutters. Another side note, all these induction smelters are just for the first Mythic Shell's egg cracking purposes. I'm sort of scared to see how many I'll need once I'm through with the rest of them, although hopefully by then I've already switched to the most efficient egg processing method. With all the expansion my processing hall has seen recently, I think it's time to add more value to the new real estate. The quest book has been pestering me to start producing these crystals out of essentia and scrap so I can make a primordial star, which to my knowledge will not be relevant for a long time. If you're a keen listener, you may have picked up the word essentia there in my last sentence. You know what that means, more mithrilium smelteries, and on top of that some thaumatoriums. Which admittedly sound cool, but as you could probably tell from my hesitation the last time I mentioned them, the whole illusion of their coolness is eviscerated once you try and automate them. Originally, I only wanted to automate one, but I guess the mnemonic matrix or whatever just wasn't feeling it that day, because I ended up having to automate 4 separate thaumatoriums, one for each crystal, and then there was the process of actually transporting the essentia. Safe to say, I do not like trying to automate anything Thaumcraft, but at least I do have a passive supply of these crystals I will never use. Along with the crystal automation, I also set up my divine shard production in the processing hall, as I hadn't put it back up since I took down everything during my infrastructure overhaul. A great thing about having almost every item you encounter passively automated is that when you decide to spend a few hours just building facades for your base, you're still making progress in the background, which allows you to do silly things like craft a fusion core. A fusion core? Don't I already have a fusion reactor installed in the floor of my storage room? Well, yeah, but this fusion core is for a nuclear craft fusion reactor, which is really a whole other animal when compared to Tech Reborn's. NC Fusion can melt down, consume liquid fuels, and has some significantly more expensive components. While I have had fusion coils passive since last episode, fusion connectors, which attach the fusion core to the ring of coils around it, are going to be a problem. They need a bunch of strange dyes from Bewitchment and some very time-consuming ingots produced in the Tech Reborn fusion reactor. I only need to craft one connector though, as that's all the fusion reactor quest requires, and I plan to have my actual reactor's coils be adjacent to their cores, making the connectors unnecessary. So after I spend a little bit of time messing around with the cauldron to get the Bewitchment dyes, I craft the connector, throw it into my AE2 system, and prepare to build a reactor. Naturally, I'm putting them in the basement of my fission tower. Yes, this does make for a tight squeeze, but it makes the most sense when looking from the perspective of base organization. While I'm building the reactors here, let's talk about what they're actually going to do. The first reactor built will be performing hydrogen-hydrogen fusion, which will provide fuel for the second reactor's deuterium-deuterium fusion. This reaction will make tritium, which can be crystallized into an ingredient I need for crafting the draconic key, which is my next major goal. The reactor should also produce some power, but it should only really be enough to continue to sustain the electromagnets that keep them operational. In fact, I actually am running them on a power line that can only receive power from the main network, just to ensure that no magnets fail if, say, they try to export all their power into the main network. So you might have noticed that the piping on these reactors is abhorrent. Well, abhorrent is sort of an understatement here. These reactors are running at 8% efficiency, and it seems like any further growth in that number has stagnated. Unfortunately, this means I'll have to repipe them the boring Ender IO way, which is too bad, because I really think fluid ducts look cool. Then again, conduits covering a reactor like this also looks really cool, so maybe I shouldn't be complaining. As per the usual, I'm not actually going to produce the tritium crystals right away, and instead I'm just going to collect the outputs of the second reactor in a black hole tank. This is partially because my priorities are shifted by some new side quests, because as we all know, side quests are 100% in charge of me and whatever I do. First off, I perform a ritual to make Tartarite ore. Now, I know that Tartarite is useful in small quantities, especially in starting the chain reaction that will eventually culminate in unlocking the best method of egg cracking, but at the moment that recipe isn't even available, so the Tartarite is essentially useless. Speaking of useless, I then spend a little bit crafting up a barocynthium ingot. Much like the flying gunpowder and wrought iron shard, barocynthium is something I'll need in the future, but is absolutely no immediate benefits. To be honest, I don't even bother automating it here. That can be a problem for me in the future to deal with. The last of the side quests I feel like completing before crafting the draconic key have to do with the greater mana core, which is in theory something I could have crafted with the exception of some Sainagh ingots back in episode 2 when I was progressing through Botania, but I opted not to due to how expensive it is. Why is it so expensive? Well, outside of everything that the lesser mana core needs to be crafted, the greater mana core also needs an everlasting guilty pool, which is a creative mode item from Botania that functions as an endless supply for mana. Like many expert mod packs tend to do, Meatballcraft provides a survival recipe for it, but it isn't cheap, with the primary issue being the fact it needs 4 Orichalcos ingots. The problem with Orichalcos ingots is the fact that for each one crafted, I need to fight the tier 3 Gaia Guardian once. Not only is this kind of tedious, but the summoning item requires Shadowium and Photonium, both ingots that are kind of annoying to make en masse. As always, the best solution for annoying to make ingots is passiving them, so it's time to assemble 2 new pun-patented automatic rune altars. Look, at least they don't require any water anymore. After some basic setup, only one problem really stood between me and having both of the ingots automated: spirit fragments. One of Photonium's ingredients that require both a really strange sunbathing routine and obnoxious hammering setup to be automated. After a while of figuring out how exactly I was going to get nightmare fuel sunbathing, I managed to get it to convert to spirit fuel, despite there being some junk with what items are actually displayed in the sunbathing pedestal, which I then managed to automatically crush using an extra utilities mechanical user with a hammer in it. The resulting spirit fragments were piped into the central rune altar automation, allowing me to finish it up. With Photonium and Shadowium no longer a problem, I can start repeatedly whacking the Gaia Guardian 3 for its prize medals. At this point in the game, the fight isn't even challenging to be honest, just time consuming. The benefit of having to fight the guy Garden 3 though, is the fact that when it dies, it gives you a bunch of Botania runes. Seeing as the Everlasting Guilty Pool requires a bunch of generating flowers to craft, this actually made the whole process way smoother than it could have been, and after the Orichalcos ingots were done cooking up in my rune altar, I had myself one Everlasting Guilty Pool, which I also believe is my first creative item. Not 100% sure on that one, seeing how much I've crafted, but if so, that's pretty cool. Upon my crafting of the Everlasting Guilty Pool, I had everything I needed to make the Greater Mana Core besides Lesser Mana Cores, which unfortunately are only slightly cheaper than it. Most notably, the Lesser Mana Core needed a Resident Tank full of Primal Mana, which is something I am producing, but this is a Resident Tank I'm talking about here, so it'll take a good bit to fill up. After doing some floor renovation in the Botania area, the tank was full, allowing me to craft both the Lesser Core, then Greater Core in succession. I'd like to know both of these items have EMC, and while the Greater Core does have a duping recipe, I'm going to assume that's for EMC production or something, as there's no way I'd ever choose to automate something I can just pull out of an EMC link. With those side quests out of the way, it's time to focus on the Draconic Key. Well, I'm actually going to focus on what I'll need after crafting the Draconic Key. See, the key unlocks recipes for blocks related to Draconic Fusion crafting, which, if you're not familiar, is a high-tier crafting process that uses a ton of electricity and expensive items to make even more expensive items. The main components used to facilitate this process need Draconic machine frames to be crafted, which in turn need resources like dragon eggs and indium to be made. Therefore, I'm going to passive both dragon eggs and indium. Indium was a relatively straightforward process, which just had me hook up some machines above my fusion reactors to make some boric acid, which is then used to dissolve platinum. I will admit that my platinum stocks are running low, resulting in suboptimal indium production, but that's a problem for later. Dragon eggs were also pretty easy to automate due to, in no small part, mystical agriculture's dedication to having a crop for pretty much everything. I decided to put my egg growing contraption right next to the one growing nether stars for divine shard production, because I don't need a full 3x3 plot for dragon eggs. After setting up an Arf Tools crafter to turn the essence into actual eggs, I had the major items of concern for Draconic frames automated, allowing me to actually focus on making the Draconic Key. First off, I need some more spatial pylons. Every second I go without passiving these things, the stupider I look. Yet I still didn't, and relied upon leftover items from last time I crafted them to make more. Nevertheless, spatial pylons aren't even the problem child of this recipe. This time around it goes to crystalline beryllium, an item that has to be crafted from Agricraft amaryllis seeds and beryllium fluoride crystals. Thanks to my processing room, I was able to deal with the beryllium fluoride crystals swiftly, but the amaryllis seeds on the other hand, they require Agricraft crop breeding. Imagine Agricraft crop breeding as forestry tree breeding's evil twin, and you can start to understand why getting the amaryllis seed was so horrible. Unlike forestry, Agricraft doesn't have a handy add-on to make life easier, so instead you're left to toil in the fields hoping that your crops spread and when they do a mutation occurs. The process of toiling took me a very long time, and was made only interesting once, when I accidentally detonated an ender crystal I had set next to my crops when I was trying to change out some soil supplements. Other than that though, it was just a bunch of toiling until I finally had the amaryllis seeds, with which I crafted the Draconic Key, giving me access to Draconic tech. Fusion crafting injectors, the main component of Draconic fusion crafting, require a few more resources than just a Draconic machine frame to be crafted. First off, they require Draconic cores, and in the pursuit of making crafting fusion injectors as painless as possible, I decided to passive them beneath my processing hall, which is made easier by the fact that some of the resources needed are already being made down there. Next, they require flux seeds, which are made by throwing void seeds into a crucible full of vidium. Not in the mood to automate another thaumatorium, I decided to go the bulk route and start throwing seeds into one of my crucibles in the cataclysmic zone. Despite having gone the bulk route, I realized that while automating flux seeds may be excessive, automating their constituent void seeds is not, considering they are seeds after all. Well, I can't actually grow the void seeds, but I can turn one into a void seedling using an infusion recipe, then stuff the seedling into a phytogenic insulator, so that's exactly what I did. The backlog supply of Draconic frames, combined with the passive void seeds and Draconic cores, allow me to begin slightly bulk crafting fusion crafting injectors, and on top of that, the resources to upgrade them. I sort of neglected to mention the fact that crafting injectors exist in 4 tiers: Basic, Wyvern, Draconic, and Chaotic, with each tier needing the tier prior in order to be crafted. At the moment, my goal was to craft up to Draconic Injectors so I could automate an incredibly efficient Dragonsteel recipe. However, obtaining Draconic Injectors is easier said than done simply due to the combination of Wyvern Core's massive resource sink and the mass production of Awakened Draconium, an ingot that can only be crafted with Wyvern Injectors and up. Regardless of the massive resource costs, I pushed forward, crafting the minimum amount of Wyvern Cores necessary for the creation of Awakened Draconium, then bulk crafting enough Awakened Draconium to make 40 Draconic Fusion Crafting Injectors. After spending a considerable amount of time fusing items, I eventually had enough injectors to start putting together my Dragonsteel automation. But then something caught my eye. The third tier of egg cracking has long eluded me throughout this chapter, but I finally have the resources at my disposal to make it happen. Using my newly acquired Awakened Draconium, the Tartarite I crafted previously, Alienus V crystals, and some World Thread, I crafted 4 Eldritch Will crystals, with which I turned into a mystical agriculture seed and automated in a phytogenic insulator. Strangely, in order to grow in a phytogenic insulator, these seeds need a moonstone catalyst, so I had to set up an array of extra utilities resonators in a crafter for their production before new Eldritch Will crystals started growing. With those Eldritch Will crystals, I crafted the Crazy Lily at a runic altar, which began a chain of obtaining an item, right-clicking it to get a new item, crafting the item into something new, then right-clicking it again. I started with the Crazy Lily, which when right-clicked, when standing on a block of obsidian while facing east, gave me a lost memory. Throwing the lost memory into a crucible filled with catalyst essentia turned into a solidified memory, which when right-clicked transformed into human imperfection and summoned a bunch of carbonite ghasts. Combining the human imperfection with a bunch of occult items from Bewitchment in a Thaumcraft infusion altar netted me an embraced imperfection, which was further combined with a bunch of Mythmanite plates, colored glass, and demonic will ingots in an iridescent altar to make evil insight. Finally, when right-clicked the evil unsight, summoned a bunch of witches and granted me Malum, which is one half of the Dynthos. What exactly is the Dynthos? The item that will allow me to crack eggs better. Kind of. Basically, the Dynthos is made of 2 items, Malum and Clausure. When right-clicked, the Dynthos will grant me Pure Taint, which is then combined into Edenstone into Warpstone. That Warpstone is used in a multi-block that performs the 3rd tier of egg cracking. That said, I do actually need to obtain a Clausure before I can do any of this, and that isn't exactly easy. Each Clausure needs 4 essences to be made: Fear, Helplessness, Darkness, and Solitude. I guess the devs were in a bad mood when designing this crafting tree. Anyway, each of the essences are made in an alchemy table from Blood Magic and have almost identical recipes, bar a type of reagent. Basically, this all boils down to a lot of microcrafting in single blocks for magic mods. As you know how much I love single blocks for magic mods, I especially love to automate them. It would be simply jubilant if I had to automate Clausure at some point. One of the shared items that essences need is Stable Fabric from Dimensional Doors, an item that requires 4 World Thread to craft. Seeing as I'm always running out of this stuff, namely due to my only supply being a giant unstable rift in the overworld, I decided that it was as good as a time as ever to use a handy dimensional stabilizer multi-block to start producing the stuff in-house. This ended up being an excellent idea, and both the fact that it was cheap and the fact there may or may not be a future project where having a massive supply of World Thread would be incredibly useful. With Stable Fabric and a bunch of small micro-crafted items collected, I crafted my Emo Essences into Clausure. I then combined it with Malum in order to get a Dynthos, which I decided to use over by the Cataclysmic Zone in the overworld. This turned out to be a good idea, as when used, the Dynthos, besides giving me my Pure Taint, also summoned a bunch of lesser Shoggoths, which quickly began spreading their ooze everywhere. And now with this Pure Taint, I can finally start cracking some eggs with hella efficiency. Except, I can't. The multi-block for egg cracking, the Shadow Fracturer, has 2 interesting characteristics. Firstly, each Shadow Fracturer needs a soul cage to be assembled. Each soul cage needs 1 of each of the 4 Emo Essences to craft, so that's going to be a lot of blood magic microcrafting. More importantly, however, in order to operate, a Shadow Fracturer needs hints of divinity and insanity. Making hints of divinity isn't really a problem, but hint of insanity requires having passive Clausure. Yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not feeling so jubilant about this one. In fact, I think I'm going to procrastinate a little and go back to automating my Draconic Fusion crafting setups. I guess Fate wasn't really happy with this decision though, because they just stopped working? After scouring over bug reports on some random forums, I concluded that it was because the crafting injectors were too close to the fusion crafting cores. This doesn't really make sense, seeing as the setup was working just fine before, but reconfiguring them so the injectors were further away did work, so something's definitely off. Anyways, I automate the 3 types of dragon steel, fire, ice, and lightning by fusing draconium with magma, packed ice, and glowstone blocks respectively, which is both easier and cheaper than the whole deal I had going with the dreaded steel automation with all those dragon forges. Unfortunately, finishing the setup means I need to address the elephant in the room and start preparing for some very, very in-depth automation. Before actually automating anything, I need to be able to build the machines with which I automate, and that means I'm going to need some weird items. Because I plan to craft the emo essences in a Meatballcraft multi-block instead of the alchemy table from Blood Magic, I'm going to need to duplicate some abyssal flesh, which means I need to do some bewitchment rituals for tongues of dog and adder's forks. Well, I don't actually have to do any, but I didn't know it at the time. Bewitchment rituals have posed a strange problem for me throughout this playthrough, simply because I can never get enough altar power for the ritual to work. Thankfully, another creative item the devs have given us access to is the Blessed Stone, which is found in a chest on Ferrado. The Blessed Stone provides infinite altar power when placed on top of an altar, and doesn't require me to spam down hundreds of leaf blocks in order to perform a ritual, which is a relief seeing as I'm definitely going to perform some rituals in the near future. Another strange thing about rituals is I haven't had a place to perform them since before I moved into the Void World. Last episode I sort of did this ad hoc hovering ritual ordeal, but I tore that down after it was complete, so yeah, here's the new ritual area, and here's me performing a ritual. A ritual that completely sucked. You see, this ritual was supposed to summon a Hellhound. This is both what the quest book and item tooltip told me. However, as you quite clearly saw, that was not a Hellhound. I really don't know why I bothered performing this ritual in the first place, honestly. Shoving a Hellhound into a mob imprisonment tool and farming their drops with a mob duplicator is way easier and less time consuming. So after obtaining my adder's forks and tongues of dog through much cruder methods than I originally intended to, I was still left with some ingredients missing for the abyssal flesh duplication: harming potions and living flesh. Wait, harming potions? Like actual vanilla harming potions? Yep, I have 800 hours into this playthrough, and somehow vanilla items are still relevant. Of course, I'm not going to approach crafting them in a vanilla way, and in fact, I'm going to do the whole operation without a single brewing stand. The thermal suite provides this really convenient way of making potions through alchemical imbuers, and I'm not going to waste an opportunity to put more machines in my processing hall. The living flesh is slightly more complicated, requiring sea serpent scales, life essence, and chrome ingots to be combined into liquid life in an immersive engineering mixer, then rotted flesh to be soaked in the said liquid life. Out of those resources, sea serpent scales are the most concerning, as I really don't want to build some contrived sea serpent farm. Thankfully though, that isn't necessary because of a fun DML workaround that has me taking pristine witch essence and crafting it up with prismarine to make the scales 100% cruelty free. Funnily enough though, getting the witch data model for the pristine matter was kind of a witch hunt. No? Okay. And I just ended up striking a poor unsuspecting villager with lightning. Then, after a little bit of fiddling around with phantom faces and the mixer, I got my living flesh automated, allowing me to duplicate my abyssal flesh. With abyssal flesh obtained, I could build the first machines of my Hint of Insanity automation. I decided to put it on top of my processing hall, which wasn't really the best place seeing as it's sort of far away from any major AE2 access points, but I thought it looked cool there, so that's where I put it. Now, while I did just build 4 elemental altars, I can't do anything with them yet because I'm not passiving a single ingredient used in making the emo essences. In order to alleviate this, my next goal is the construction of 2 honey smelter ovens for the purpose of producing otherworldly tears and dimensional sand. Honey smelter ovens, the multi-block form of the witch's oven from Bewitchment, are really useful for large-scale fume production, but require some strange resources to craft, namely honeycomb ingots, so only after a brief stint in my bee laboratory could I build my honey smelter ovens, which I proceed to hook up to my honey supply and some EMC links. While the dimensional sand is ready right out of the oven, the other oven wasn't actually making otherworldly tears, just its precursor cloudy oil. I then had to put the cloudy oil through one of my pun-patented distillery setups before being able to stockpile otherworldly tears. Along with the Bewitchment automation, I also automated Oblivion Death Bomb and Dreadium plate production in some crafters, as they also happen to be needed in the emo essences. Just to recap, so far I've built 6 multi-blocks, 1 junky Bewitchment distillery setup, and at least 4 different crafters. And that's just the beginning. You know how I have a small feud with automating single blocks for magic mods due to their unavoidable jank? Well, because I'm automating Hint of Insanity a little earlier than I think it's intended to be automated, I can't use a multi-block called the Berserker Forge to automate the production of blood magic reagents, leaving me to figure out how exactly the enigma known colloquially as a Hellfire Forge is to be automated. Unlike usual, Hellfire Forges aren't jank in that you can't figure out what sides of the input and what side's output sense. Instead, they're janking the, if I need 2 identical items in 2 different slots for my recipe to complete, then you're shit out of luck if you ever want to automate me sense. Which means I'm going to have to employ an old friend of mine, XNet. Not every reagent recipe in the Hellfire Forge is like this though, so I'm going to try to use limited item filters wherever possible. As for fueling the Hellfire Forges, I just got a crucible on top being fed will shards from over at the blood magic automation area. I was originally concerned I would have to do something more drastic, like manually pulling out empty tartaric gems and replacing them with ones full of will, but thankfully they can just soak up will from the atmosphere while inside of Hellfire Forges, so that alleviated a big potential problem. After fooling around with XNet and Ender.io conduits for a while, I managed to configure a system that takes items from a bank of drawers and inputs the items correctly into the forges, then takes the outputs and loads them into the correct elemental altar. A major detail here is the layer of abstraction the drawer bank provides to the setup, where instead of my XNet system and conduits having to worry about reading outputs from various sources, they only have to worry about checking a drawer controller for the right items. This also makes it much easier to expand the system if I ever need to, which is hopefully never. Now, the items in the drawer buffers really come from a plethora of places. My AE2 network, an EMC link, DML loot fabricators, the sheer variety of items that reagents need in order to be crafted is insane. And the thing is, even with the essences automated within the elemental altars, there's still more work to be done, as they need to be combined with an oblatus, which has its own crafting rabbit hole. Like, remember sterilized sacrificial altars? Well, they're coming back big time. The cool thing about the location I chose for this setup, though, is that there's already a set of sterilized sacrificial altars, so I can stack my 2 new ones on top of them and everything looks visually unified. The actual production of oblatus isn't that interesting, as it's essentially just machine spam outside of the 2 sacrificial altars, though I will say the inclusion of Abyssalcraft crystallizers in the automation chain earns it the regrettable distinction of having a side IO sensitive magic mod single block, and we were doing so well too. With oblatus and the emo essences automated, all there was left to do was throw everything into a crafter with some red strings from Botania and make some clausurae. Now you might notice I'm not actually making that much, and that's because a problem with having all my Hellfire Forges in the same chunk is that each one's recipe consumes a different amount of will, and some of them consume way more than others. This results in certain reagents being crafted at far slower paces than others, and when they are crafted, they slow down everything else's production as well. This isn't really a problem I'm going to deal with though. I'm just going to let buffers of everything grow until it resolves itself. So now that I have a passive source of clausurae, Hint of Insanity is just one step away. However, I still need to make the ingredients for Hint of Divinity, which actually just involves some DML. After running around the Twilight Forest for a while, training a data model, then using it to set up a divine ironwood production array, I was ready to start actually making hints of divinity and insanity. This process, much to my dismay, is performed in a spatial crucible, meaning I'm going to need 2 sets of spatial pylons. Best get to crafting them, I guess. The processing hall really came in handy here, as much of the microcrafting could be performed simultaneously, which when combined with my extended crafting terminal made the whole process trivial. And so, upon the construction of 2 spatial crucibles and the routing of clausurae and divine ironwood into them, I had a passive supply of hints of divinity and insanity. That's really cool and all, but these fluids are pointless without a Shadow Fracturer to use them. Shadow Fracturers aren't exactly a cheap multi-block, and they definitely aren't cheap when you decide to build all the ones you'll need for the rest of the playthrough all at once. Yeah. In what I like to call a fit of genius, I decided to make all 43 of the things, which is more than enough to do every possible recipe in its own unique machine. Anyways, resource-wise, aside from strange resources like blood-infused wood, warpstone, and opal blocks, they need soul cages, which, as mentioned previously, require 1 of each of the emo essences. Thankfully, my Hint of Insanity automation completely negated this problem, but the other resources were still an issue. Blood-infused wood had to sit around in an altar for a while to be made, and I had to do some gorilla ore processing in my processing hall to make the opal I needed. Warpstone was definitely the easiest and most fun resource to make, although I gotta feel bad for the village I just surrounded with a horde of shadows. After putting all the fracturer materials in a crate and transporting it over to the designated shadow fracturer area, it was time to start building a lot of multi-blocks. This is the first time I've ever done an en masse multi-block operation like this, and it really makes me feel like I'm playing an expert mod pack. Like, this is the type of stuff I'm used to seeing in other people's bases and going, whoa, that must have taken them a while. But yeah, with the multi-blocks built, I still have to automate them, which is going to be a process. First off, there's the matter of getting the hints of insanity and divinity into the shadow fracturers. I originally opted for Ender IO conduits, but then I remembered that fluid lasers from Actually Editions existed, and spent a while tearing down all the conduits so they could be replaced. Next up is pre-crack egg processing. Basically, the shadow fracturer is a little too advanced for some lowly eggs to be placed inside, so instead the eggs must be combined with a cut garnet and some liquid XP and an arcane escalator to become enchanted, then be cracked in the shadow fracturer. This kind of disappointed me, as I was really hoping to get rid of the massive array of thermal machines in my egg cracking room, and I guess I did get rid of the induction smelters, but now I'm just replacing them with arcane escalators. After ruminating for a bit though, I built this pretty cool configuration of them that I think doesn't look too machine spammy, and actually looks really cool when it's operating. Now that the infrastructure for the fracturers is in place, it's time to wire everything up. And let me tell you, this is a time consuming process. Like, just placing down the item conduits took a while, and that's without filtering anything. Plus, the decision to handle item outputs with an AE2 subnetwork definitely didn't save me any time, but at the end of the day, I ended up with a very, very efficient egg cracking system. I knew shadow fracturers had a better input to output ratio, but I didn't expect them to work nearly as fast as they do. I can only imagine what this terminal will look like when all 40 or so of these things are active. I then spent a little bit of time working on the facade for my fracturers. I mean, if you're going to build a massive array of multi-blocks, you should be willing to make them look like they aren't completely out of place in your base. I will be honest here, I don't even finish building the facade before getting distracted by my next goal. It shouldn't surprise you a bit that this whole shadow fracturer tangent was just one big side quest. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be useful in the long run, but technically I didn't have to do any of that. In the same vein, my next goal is also considered a side quest by the quest book, but I still think it's pretty vital to completing the chapter, so it's a main quest in my heart. As for what this next goal is, it's the automated production of recursive powder. This, like the shadow fracturers, is a Meatballcraft original, and also just happens to be one of my favorite automation lines in the game. Before even considering the production of recursive powder though, I need to craft an item called the Purity Offer, as it sort of kickstarts this whole quest chain. Funnily enough, the Purity Offer has to be crafted in an ME Mythic assembler, which is that one really expensive multi-block from forever ago I said will maintain little relevancy. Well, here's its 15 minutes of fame. Well, actually it'll get the limelight in a little bit. First off, I need the Purity Offer's ingredients, of which I'm only missing 256 mutable combs. Well, time to head down to the bee lab and start genetically engineering the best mutable bees you've ever seen. I need my combs pronto. So maybe making all the mutable combs took a little while. That's fine. I do have to reassemble the Mythic assembler from the time I took down all the stuff over by my Mythic miners, however long ago that was. I also had to craft 64 pure daisies for the offer, which is something I initially overlooked, but at least it gave me something to do while I waited for my bees to muster up the combs I needed. After a little more waiting, I finally had all the ingredients for the Purity Offer. Unfortunately, I was met with even more waiting upon crafting it, as the recipe took a little more than 8 minutes to complete. Regardless, now that I had the Purity Offer, I had to, well, offer it to a pure daisy so it could be converted into a Ragnarok sigil, which I then combined with 4 crystal clusters I obtained from some dimension a long time ago to make an Aesir tribute. I then offered the Aesir tribute to the elves through one of the elven gateways I had lying around to get an orchid. The orchid is a functional flower from Botania that typically isn't gated behind several hundred hours of gameplay, as it usually just generates ores from surrounding stone blocks. Meatballcraft's orchid, however, is unique in the sense that it generates a special block that would just slightly unbalance the pack if available earlier. This block, Arkenstone, is the main ingredient for recursive powder, and as I mentioned previously, it is very fun to process. That said, I do have to automate Arkenstone production before I can go about processing it. Orchid automation is relatively simple and revolves around an RF Tools builder with stone blacklisted. Essentially, whenever a block of stone is replaced with an ore by the orchid, it will automatically be broken. Then the empty space left behind will be replaced with stone by a second builder. The outputs will be sent to a filtration mechanism that voids everything but the Arkenstone, which will be sent to my processing array. The reason Arkenstone processing is so fun is simply because of the amount of byproducts obtained by doing so. Basically, the Arkenstone is taken and processed by 6 grinders, each using one of the Mythic miner fluids, and each producing unique byproducts as it grinds the Arkenstone down into recursive powder. What's so cool about these byproducts, though, is that through them I can produce evanescent Bifrost and small amounts of Sedonite. By combining the two into evanescent Sedonite, then crushing it in a raw crusher and pressurizing the results, I can get way more Sedonite than the amount of Sedonite dust I originally put into the loop. This essentially forms an exponentially growing Sedonite loop that pretty much matches the efficiency of my plasmatic condenser Sedonite production. Despite this setup not having a 100% uptime due to Arkenstone's rarity in the Orchid loop pool, it is operating enough to produce enough Sedonite to allow me to shut off my plasmatic condenser. This is cool because I think energy consumption might be becoming a problem, but we're going to ignore that for now by focusing on something very similar to Arkenstone production, Ethereum production. By throwing an Arkenstone into an Elven gateway, we are given in return an Orchid Ignis, which functions identically to the Orchid but with netherrack instead of stone and a loot pool of ores from the nether. What makes automating the Orchid Ignis slightly harder than automating the normal Orchid is that it can only operate in the nether, meaning I'm going to need a way to transport mana over there. Seeing as there isn't really a way to transport mana interdimensionally, and I didn't feel like making a Kekimura setup in the nether, I decided to go with the cheat option and make an everlasting guilty pool. With Shadowium and Photonium already automated, this process was much easier than the first time, and soon enough I was setting up my Orchid Ignis in the nether. While the process of getting Ethereum ore is identical to that of getting Arkenstone, the two have very different processing requirements, with Ethereum ore needing to be fused with a variety of items inside of an arc furnace in order to become an Ethereum ingot. That's a problem for slightly later though, because I'm itching to automate Awakened Draconium. Like many resources in this pack, Mystical Agriculture has us covered when it comes to Awakened Draconium production. Well, mostly covered. Seeing as Awakened Draconium is supposed to be like really expensive, the devs saw fit to make it slightly more difficult to obtain than just combining 9 essences into an ingot. Instead, I have to combine 8 essences with Draconic Dust, which is produced by Draconic Bees. Thankfully, I obtained Draconic Bees quite a bit ago, so all I have to do is turn them into genetic aberrations and automate them. As per the usual, the genetic aberration step is going to take a while, so in the meantime I build an arc furnace for Ethereum production and build a small setup for the automatic production of honeycomb ingots, as they're one of the ingredients for Ethereum. Tapping into a few other things I've already automated, like void seeds, I automated Ethereum next to my Arkenstone production. I'm not buffering it though, as the rate of throughput on the ore is so slow that there's really no reason to at the moment. Once Ethereum was automated, my Draconic Bees were ready to produce, and just like that, I passive awakened Draconium. Way back when I built the fusion reactors, I mentioned I was buffering their outputs. Well, that was true except for one, neutron fluid. Unfortunately, it turns out neutron fluid is kind of important due to its interesting property of turning awakened draconium ingots into ultimate nuggets. All hope wasn't lost though, as nuclear-craft fusion reactors have pretty big internal buffers, so after I set up a new black hole tank, I was able to immediately hook up the small supply of neutron fluid I had to a fluid transposer and start producing some ultimate nuggets. They actually won't be useful immediately, but beginning to stockpile them is probably a good idea long term. Another benefit of passive awakened draconium is my ability to make more compact chicken coops than the large ones I'm using for egg production. Before continuing though, I will say I never actually used these coops because I heard they were not as fast as the multi-block ones. So that's going to make this a little awkward. Nevertheless, the first step of making more compact coops is actually helpful for making the multi-blocks as well, so at least this part is relevant. Basically, coops, regardless of their size, need 2 blocks to be built: petrified wood and amber. Both of these resources are incredibly hard to find naturally, and I have neglected to passively automate them until this point, where I installed 2 cold iron forges in my processing hall. After providing them with inputs of cold iron, coal, charcoal, and amber, but like the item, not the block I'm trying to produce, I allowed them to stockpile for a little bit. In the meantime, I crafted vibranium and magnetic monopoles. Both of these are late chapter 4 resources that gate a good bit of content, with vibranium gating the next dimension and magnetic monopoles gating some machine parts. Neither of them were difficult to produce though, with vibranium just being a combination of some ingots from my shadow fracturers, and magnetic monopoles just being inderium and selenite combined in a Tech Reborn reactor. Technically, I've already crafted some vibranium, but this time I'm crafting it in larger quantities. With the time it took for the magnetic monopoles to finish crafting in the fusion reactor, I had enough petrified wood and amber to make one of the new single block coops using Compact Machines projectors. Like I mentioned previously though, once crafted I completely neglected the coops due to their supposed inefficiency. Remember highly advanced machine frames, those Tech Reborn blocks I passived earlier on in the episode? Well, while they're useful on their own, they're also a component of highly advanced machine cases, which are really expensive. Not only do they need the HAMFs, but they also need draconic frames, magnetic monopoles, adamantium plates, elite plating, and ultimate nuggets. When automating something this massive, it's good to have priorities. I like focusing on the most difficult / least convenient parts of the recipe first, just to get them out of the way. So in this case, I chose draconic frames, as they need some pretty strange resources like MOX fuel and dragon eggs. Despite already automating dragon eggs earlier, I decided to give them the full 3x3 plot treatment in my mystical agriculture area to ensure their production rates can keep up with the potential draconic frame demand. I then shut down my 2 MOX reactors in order to start stockpiling their fuel in my AE2 network. After that, automating draconic frames really came down to setting up a few interfaces, extracting a bunch of items, and doing the classic act of stringing together a wall of Tech Reborn machines, although this time I also have to use a few extended crafting interfaces. Once I automated draconic frames, I decided the next highest priority item to automate would be elite plating from Nuclearcraft. In theory, this item shouldn't be nearly as high priority, considering I already have it passived, but the materials I've been producing in my Shadow Fracturers provide much more efficient recipes than the ones I'm using, and I'm taking their requirement in making HAMCs as an opportunity to centralize their production. Before doing that though, I centralized the production of some Nuclearcraft alloys I had been previously producing in isolated setups, as if I'm going to have centralized plating production, it needs to be able to access the alloys from my AE2 network. With the alloys centrally automated, I decided to put my new plating automation where most of the old automation was, down near the bottom of my fission tower. This worked to my advantage, as some of the strange resources needed for some of the plating was conveniently already automated there. So after making this cool ring of crafters surrounding my AE2 interface, elite plating had been successfully automated, and now that I have elite plating, I can begin the main automation setup for HAMCs, as all the other parts can just be assembled from items I already have sitting around my AE2 network, with the exception of magnetic monopoles, which I will manually insert into the crafter. After more machine stringing in the Tech Reborn area, I had finally somewhat passive production of highly advanced machine casings. But why exactly? A multi-block known as the Extreme Pressure Turbine. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this multi-block. Out of its two recipes, one only exists to be replaced once the recipe has been performed, and the other generates a meager amount of power even when compared to the much cheaper Extreme Reactor turbines. Nevertheless, I do need to perform the first recipe at least once, so I guess I have to build this thing, which by the way, is really big, and as you could probably tell by it requiring HAMCs, also really expensive. I installed the Extreme Pressure Turbine in my main hall, which has gone surprisingly empty to be completely honest, and then I hooked it up to a supply of Molten Stellar Alloy and Lithium Fluoride. Neither of these resources are particularly noteworthy, with one just being an alloy of Melodic Alloy and Nether Stars produced by my alloy setup, and the other a fluid coming from my Nuclearcraft processing setup beneath my fission reactors. Upon inputting the fluids, I waited a bit until the Extreme Pressure Turbine pumped out a single ingot of Promethium, which is really the only ingot of Promethium it ever needs to make, although I will keep it running a little longer. The reason for this is because Promethium unlocks a significantly more useful multi-block called the Inertial Confinement Reactor, which can perform all the recipes the Tech Reborn fusion reactor can, while also being able to make more Promethium itself. Like always though, I'm not going to craft anything related to the Inertial Confinement Reactor immediately, and instead I'm going to actually progress the main questline for once, which means it's time to explore a new dimension. Renia, our next destination, is home to a few useful resources that'll help make a few recipes more efficient, along with the means of obtaining a new weapon. In order to get there, I'll need a Renia artifact, which is actually really cheap. The only ingredients of note are the Necromantic and Physidilic Primes from Astral Sorcery, but that's really only because they're from Astral Sorcery. Once I had infused up the old artifact, I threw it in my trusty warp drive and arrived in Renia, which really doesn't look like a good place to vacation. Rising from the dreadful black stone that makes up the planet's surface are a variety of structures, many of which providing items meant to solve puzzles. One of these puzzles allowed me to craft the Mark of the Samurai, which is the first step in obtaining an item that will become important slightly later, and another allowed me to craft the Essence of the Room, with named papers and recursive powder. The Essence of the Room, which is sadly not a reference to Tommy Wiseau's 2003 masterpiece, can be combined with two perfected Opinium cords to make the Kikoku, which is a very powerful sword from Extra Utilities 2. Now, I don't know exactly why it's so powerful, but I believe it's something to do with the fact that it deals divine damage, which I think ignores armor, but I'm not sure about that one. The key resources from Renia aren't anything to do with the puzzles though, and actually involve resource extraction with an immersive engineering excavator. This is actually the first time I've ever had to use one of these, and coming out of the experience, I would not recommend them, mainly because of the prospecting. Unlike most void miners, the pool of what an excavator can mine up is determined by the chunk it sits in. In order to tell what that pool is without having to build an excavator, check, then disassemble it and move it into the next chunk, you can prospect a chunk beforehand. This isn't a very long process, but it turns out the ore vein I'm looking for isn't particularly common, so I spend a bit just wandering through the bleak landscape of Renia drilling up sample cores. You cannot imagine the joy I felt when I found the right ore vein. I mean, that really just made my day, to be honest. Immediately after seeing the positive results in my core sample, I set up my excavator and hooked it up to power with a flux point. So, what exactly is it that the excavator is digging up? Rhenium and holographic ores. Rhenium ore can be processed into an ingot that makes the recipes for vibranium and jeweled runium much more efficient, and holographic ore can be made into gems that make draconic fusion crafting injectors cheaper. Before going to process my new ores though, not all of my work on Renia is done. I need to turn my Mark of the Samurai into a sword shield, and I'm going to be completely honest, the process didn't work. The general idea of the process was that I was supposed to terraform a 3x3 plus sign shape of Renia into 5 different biomes, and then click the mark of the samurai while standing in the center of the shape. And I really did try to make the puzzle work, like I used the arcane terraformer and fueled it with impetus, the sparks to indicate the machine was working appeared on activation, but at the end of the day, the biomes just weren't changing. So I'll admit, I just voided the mark of the samurai and used JEI to give me a sword shield. Now, you can think of this what you will, but I really didn't see any other option because this isn't a problem I can just work around. Putting all that Renia stuff behind us, I wanted to super enchant my Kikoku, as even though it's powerful now, my current sword still does more damage. The recipe for doing so has 2 major items of concern. Firstly, 4 promethium ingots, and secondly, 12 ender feathers. Now, I'm glad I let my extreme pressure turbine continue running, because waiting for the promethium otherwise would have sucked. With the promethium accounted for, it was time to get the ender feathers, which unfortunately involved the lengthy process of flying around Ferrado and assaulting any ender chickens within my range of view, which was admittedly very few. Eventually, after 30 minutes of lying around like an idiot, I had gathered enough feathers to craft the Super Enchanted Kikoku, which is just as powerful as I'd hoped it'd be. The promethium needed in Super Enchanting the Kikoku reminded me that it's probably time to go and build the Inertial Confinement Reactor. This otherwise expensive multi-block was made almost trivial by my extensive infrastructure, seeing as the only item that presented any difficulty in crafting were the 6 fusion connectors it needed. I mean, their recipe was difficult enough to the point where I was thankful I had already crafted one, and it's all because of Forgotten Combs. Bee breeding is always a time-intensive process, and this was exacerbated by the fact that Forgotten Combs, when processed, don't always output the amnesia wax I need to craft the connectors with. But after an hour of waiting, I collected all the resources required and built an inertial confinement reactor, which I proceeded not to automate. Unlike usual, this wasn't because I didn't feel like it, it's actually because I was indecisive as to whether or not I should automate monopole magnets or promethium in it. So yeah, in the end I just ended up automating neither. What I did automate though was rhenium, which only needed the classic 1-step 4x ore processing from thermal expansion. And then using that rhenium, I automated both vibranium and jeweled runium, taking advantage of the better production rates rhenium provides. Fun fact, I was able to advance to chapter 5 as soon as I obtained rhenium, but I didn't choose to. Why? First degree mythic fractals. I don't know if you've noticed, but there have been a lot of random items popping up that don't really have a purpose. I'm still passiving them though. Raw iron shards, flying gunpowder, well, all these items are combined into an item called the first degree mythic fractal, which is used extensively in the late game. Now, I'm gonna be honest, automating each individual item for this is not interesting, like at all, so I'm just going to give a real brief overview of the process. First, I needed a phasing gem, which required me to use a spatial phaser in the Undergarden biome while in Creeponia. Well, the Undergarden biome does not generate in Creeponia, so I had to use an environmental terraformer from Extra Utilities 2 to make a suitable environment. Next, I began duplicating sword shields using various metals from my shadow fracturers. With that process complete, I then crafted a new warper because apparently there's a dimension snuck in right at the end of the chapter. Before going to the new dimension though, I started passively producing deep metamorphic stone, barycinthium ingots, abyssal flesh, and phasing alloy plates. Again, none of these setups are particularly unique, so I'm not really gonna go into any detail over them. The last resource remaining, living Myrmitite, resides on that dimension I made a warper for, Myrmex. And that's pretty much there is on Myrmex. Compared to the other dimensions I've explored, Myrmex pretty much has nothing but these special trees whose saplings are used to make Myrmitite in a plasmatic condenser. Like, Myrmitite itself isn't even found on the planet. It has to be made on base. Regardless, I automated Myrmitite in my conveniently decommissioned plasmatic condenser, thank you Arkenstone Processing, and then combined that Myrmitite with some reagents I started producing with my Hell Forges over by my Hint of Insanity production, turns out making the setup expandable was actually useful, to make living Myrmitite. Combining all these resources along with some mythic plates I was making from fish coming from my mythic miners netted me a first degree mythic fractal. Was that probably the most scuffed description of how one is obtained in the history of Meatballcraft YouTube videos? Probably. So is that it? Is it time for chapter 5? Almost. I still need to fulfill one side quest. Cursed Myrmitite production. Thankfully, this was as simple as dumping some Myrmitite in a mana pool, sending it over to a thaumatorium in my processing hall, infusing it with Vidium, then combining the result with a bucket and an Eldritch Will Crystal and an Arcane Auto Infuser to get a bucket of this stuff. This was probably a personal record in terms of automation speed, and soon enough I had a neat bucket recycler set up extracting the cursed Myrmitite from the buckets being crafted, then sending the buckets back into the auto crafter. After that was complete, all I had to do was throw some Rhenium into a mana pool to craft Rhenium Catalysts, then combine 8 of them with a Nether Star to craft an Eden Star, marking the beginning of chapter 5. Man, Chapter 4 was something else. I really think this is where the pack is beginning to shine. The automation tasks are difficult but still rewarding, and there's honestly been very few moments where I felt genuinely frustrated at how the pack is balanced. All in all, I might have a little more time in the pack than other people at the same point in progression as I am, but I'm sticking with it. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.